Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Who Framed Roger Rabbit, an action-adventure title developed by Rare and published by LJN for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1989. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 127, and it is a special episode because this is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one is sponsored by Steve Novoselic. Steve did record a message for all of us to listen to. So Steve, take it away.
Hey everybody, I'm here to talk about Who Framed Roger Rabbit on the NES and why I chose this as my sponsored game. Well, when I was a kid, I didn't own Who Framed Roger Rabbit on the NES, but I had a friend who did. That meant I spent a ton of time at their house playing the game, watching, swapping turns, trying to make progress on this game. Sometimes I'd rent it as well, back in the day. You'd go to the video store and rent your game and bring it home. But I never actually did beat it. So I wanted to see what Tony could do with this one. Again, the music here, over and over, over and over, burned into my brain. It's super catchy. If you play it for a long time, though, it can get really annoying and relentless. And while I didn't really realize it at the time, but it seems like this game has pseudo point-and-click mechanics. You search rooms, you get items, and I just love it when you get told over and over and over, there's nothing in this building until you want to throw the controller. Even with the quirks, it was fun. I liked really going inside buildings and driving around the city as well. And having, Roger being the sidekick, kind of cool. It was different than most NES games. I loved Roger Rabbit movie as a kid of the 80s. It was awesome to kind of play in that world. It was frustrating at times, but it's also part of the magic, I guess, around NES era gaming. And I would say that, the fun of the game, it's kind of what makes CGT community so great. Hanging out in the Discord, taking on the challenges, reliving these classic experiences with friends. It's like stepping back into childhood gaming sessions with your friends, but with a crew that gets it. So here's to everyone in the community celebrating victories or laughing about the struggles. It's always a blast, and thank you. And thank you, Tony, for taking the time to play this game and give you a review. See you later.
Thank you, Steve, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the pantheon of classic gaming. If a game reaches the pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Who Framed Roger Rabbit is an action-adventure title developed by Rare and published by LJN for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1989. Before we can talk about Who Framed Roger Rabbit, we need to take a step back and talk about the early years of famed game development studio Rare, along with their relationship with a number of different publishing partners, with LJN being the one most relevant to our discussion, and the creation of the Academy Award-winning film that would eventually result in our game of the day. Before we get to all that, though, let's start talking once again about Rare, the UK company founded by brothers Chris and Tim Stamper that began its life as Ultimate Play the Game in 1982, and would, for several years after its founding, focus on creating games for the UK microcomputer market, most prominently the ZX Spectrum line of computers developed by Sinclair Research. As Ultimate Play the Game, the Stampers had some early successes with creating innovative titles that were unlike the kinds of gaming experiences that other game development studios typically developed. And this concept of constantly trying to create something new and innovative as opposed to stereotypical and derivative would form the foundation of the company's DNA from the very beginning of its existence. Despite releasing some pretty popular ZX Spectrum titles in the years after the company was formed, the Stampers recognized that if they wanted to grow as a company, they needed to expand and diversify beyond the UK-centric, fairly limited ZX Spectrum market. And here, an opportunity would present itself in 1985 that would change the trajectory of the company's future forever. In 1985, software publisher Ocean was in talks to purchase Ultimate Play the Game, along with any related licenses and other intellectual property. And the Stampers realized that this sale was likely going to happen, whether they wanted it to or not. So they decided to stand up a separate shell company of sorts, which they called Rare Limited, as a means of insulating themselves and their team from any of the corporate politics that were accompanying Ocean's buyout of Ultimate Play the Game, which further allowed the Stampers to sell their share of the company without issue. No longer tethered to Ultimate Play the Game, the Stampers turned their attention entirely to the formalization and stabilization of Rare Limited. With their new company established, the Stampers now had to figure out where they wanted to focus and what kinds of games they wanted to create. They knew they wanted to standardize on a stable technology platform, something that wouldn't have a ton of variability that would need to be accounted for whenever they created a new title, which meant that the computer market of the time was effectively out, since there were a huge number of proprietary systems, hardware, and software that made developing for anything other than a singular computer platform a challenge. And they knew they wanted to choose a technology platform that would have a fairly large number of users, with the potential for even greater growth, since their prior efforts on the ZX Spectrum, while successful, had an upper bound for potential sales given the relatively small size of that particular market. Those factors are what led Rare to begin looking across the broader video game landscape, at which point they started to learn more about Nintendo's 8-bit family computer, or Famicom, home console that had just released a couple years prior in Japan, and was about to make its way to North America and other geographic regions. To call the Famicom a major console release would be an understatement, as it quickly gained a foothold in the Japanese gaming market, and all indications were that it was going to take over the North American gaming market as well, effectively with no competition given the 1983 video game market crash that left companies like Atari on life support. Rare saw Nintendo's 8-bit platform as an opportunity to increase their presence in the broader video game market, and were hopeful that they would be able to replicate their earlier success on a much larger scale, which in turn would make the company more profitable and allow them to tackle bigger and better games in the future. There was just one problem. Nintendo was not in the habit of simply giving development kits out to small independent developers, and Rare didn't have the working capital to buy their way into the Famicom ecosystem. So they did the only thing an aspiring group of talented game developers could do. They hacked their way into the industry. Okay, maybe not literally, but in fact, they did sort of hack their way into Nintendo's good graces. For those who may not be aware, when Nintendo released the Famicom, they designed it so that unless you were one of their formal licensees, there was no way to actually release a title for the system, because you didn't have the technical tools or software needed to bypass Nintendo's hard-coded copy protection schemes. This was done for a couple of reasons, the most prominent of which was Nintendo's desire to exert control over which video game studios could develop games for their system, as well as a drive to limit the number of games each studio could release in a given year, all of which was an attempt at minimizing the potential of low-effort, poor-quality titles flooding the market and eroding consumer confidence in Nintendo as a company. What this meant was that if you were going to develop games for a Nintendo console, Nintendo itself had to give you the keys to its virtual kingdom. Despite not having a formal agreement in place with Nintendo, Rare decided to import a Famicom console and sat down to effectively reverse engineer the system, bypassing the copy protection that Nintendo had touted as impossible to crack, and creating a series of demos that they hoped would prove Rare's prowess as a technically talented and creative team of video game designers. Rare ended up sending that set of demos to Nintendo, and in an almost unheard of move, Nintendo was so impressed with Rare's work that they offered them a development partnership contract, and even offered to fund all of Rare's upcoming titles, as long as all of those games would remain Nintendo exclusives. For a small company like Rare, that offer was a dream come true, so they immediately accepted Nintendo's conditions and began working more closely together, a relationship that would last for almost 20 years and would see the two companies collaborate on countless titles. In fact, in just the 5 years following Nintendo and Rare forming their partnership, Rare developed over 40 titles for various Nintendo platforms, including arcade cabinets, the NES home console, and the Game Boy Portable console, with a number of those games becoming well respected across the industry and much beloved by gamers around the world. The thing is, though, not every company publishing titles on Nintendo's popular consoles was quite as well respected as Rare. Some companies weren't in it for the long haul and viewed video game development as more of a hobby to make some money, as opposed to broader aspirations to take on the industry and become true professional development studios. Other companies were simply less experienced and would need additional time to develop the skills needed to deliver quality titles to the masses. Some companies just wanted to make as much money as possible without regard to the quality of releases. These quantity over quality organizations simply wanted to release as many games as they could, as quickly as they could, in the hopes that consumers would eventually buy their products, oftentimes enticing potential buyers with the promise of the hottest film, television, or toy license, albeit in interactive video game form. One of those companies who attempted to use shiny licenses to attract consumers was none other than LJN, an incredibly prolific video game publisher from the mid to late 80s who, interestingly, got its start as an incredibly prolific toy manufacturer who, you may have guessed, used shiny licenses to attract consumers to their products. LJN was founded by a man named Jack Friedman in 1970, who, after noticing how successful toy companies like Mattel and Milton Bradley were becoming, decided that he too wanted to be in the toy business. Bolstered by some funding from his current employer, Friedman stood up LJN with one core goal in mind: to make as much money as possible by licensing popular entertainment properties and creating toys based on those properties. Early efforts using this license-driven business model were moderately successful, but it wouldn't take long before LJN would discover a veritable gold mine, as they would end up purchasing the rights to make toys based on the forthcoming 1982 science fiction film E.T., which at the time, no other toy companies were interested in. Before E.T. was released, it wasn't really known whether it would perform well at the box office, so the prospect of making toys based on a potentially unsuccessful film wasn't all that appealing to the big toy makers of the time. Because of that, LJN was able to purchase the toy license for E.T. for just $25,000. Yes, just $25,000. Well, it wasn't long after E.T. was released before LJN realized that they had just scored a massive win, as E.T. would become the highest grossing film of all time, at least as of 1982, and would dominate pop culture in a way that not many other films did around the early 80s. With their $25,000 license in hand, LJN began making various E.T. toys, dolls, and action figures, eventually selling almost $25 million worth of E.T.-related products, an influx of capital that was used to acquire even more potentially lucrative licenses, such as an agreement with the World Wrestling Federation, or WWF, to create a full line of action figures based on popular wrestlers of the time, the creation of toys based on the action-packed Thundercats cartoon, and, somewhat strangely, toy-based representations of real-world celebrities like Michael Jackson and Brooke Shields. LJN became incredibly successful throughout the mid-80s, so much so that they attained a position of competitiveness with other much larger toy manufacturers, and leadership at LJN believed that they would be able to continue that upward trajectory as they continued to sign ever more lucrative licensing deals. In 1985, though, things began to shift, as LJN would be purchased by American media conglomerate MCA, and after that purchase, LJN was directed to expand their overall portfolio beyond the traditional toy market. Instead of being focused solely on physical toys, under MCA's ownership, LJN would now begin exploring the digital world of video game entertainment. Somewhat interestingly, LJN's business model didn't really change as it pivoted to focus on the video game market, in that the company still believed that the best way to quick profits was through licensing popular media properties. Only this time, the focus would be on creating interactive experiences based on those properties. This led LJN to acquire a large number of film licenses for future video games, including such blockbusters as Jaws, The Karate Kid, and Back to the Future. And you better believe they weren't going to just sit on those licenses. They immediately began funding the creation of video games based on those properties, and in the process, began to develop a bit of a reputation for churning out licensed games of, shall we say, varying degrees of quality. Now, LJN was not actually a video game development studio, so it's not like they personally created all of these games. Instead, what they would do is team up with other development studios, effectively outsource the work, and then publish the resulting titles on any number of video game systems and platforms. This publishing arrangement worked just fine for LJN, and over the course of their lifetime, they'd publish a number of fairly successful games, at least commercially, while occasionally they'd even release a game that gamers would think was worth playing. The thing is, the quality of each game they'd eventually release was dependent entirely on the development studios they'd work with, as LJN itself applied little to no quality control on their titles. As long as a game started up and passed the relatively low requirements for being published on a given console platform, LJN was happy. And there are numerous examples of games with egregious bugs and other issues that were still released to the market, simply because the company wanted to make money, and in order to do that, they needed games on store shelves. One of the development studios that LJN would partner with several times in the mid to late 80s was none other than Rare, the UK-based company that was quickly making a name for itself as a quality studio with a penchant for creating unique experiences for Nintendo's console ecosystem. While LJN did not have a ton of quality control, they still recognized talent when they saw it, and Rare, while still relatively new to the industry, was definitely a talented group of developers and designers. So, it's not surprising that LJN would seek out partnering opportunities with Rare whenever possible, which is what resulted in the company working on licensed games based on a number of different popular properties, including horror films like A Nightmare on Elm Street, comic book adaptations like The Amazing Spider-Man, and, most pertinent to our discussion, whodunit mysteries like the eventual blockbuster film Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Roger Rabbit himself got his start not on the silver screen, but rather on the printed page, as depicted in the 1981 novel Who Censored Roger Rabbit, written by American author Gary K. Wolfe. Who Censored Roger Rabbit tells a tale of a 1980s world in which humans and comic strip characters live together, with the lines between cartoon and humanity blurred significantly. In the book, which stars many of the same characters as the movie, private investigator Eddie Valiant is attempting to solve the murder of the titular bunny himself, with a generally dark story involving blackmail, doppelgangers, adultery, and plenty of other themes that, if you read it, just scream Disney movie. Or at least that's what then Disney president Ron Miller said after learning of the book, because shortly after Who Censored Roger Rabbit was published, Disney bought the rights to create a film version of the story. Work on the Roger Rabbit film adaptation began almost right away, with a story that didn't stray too far from the book's darker themes, and Pee Wee Herman actor Paul Reubens attached to star as the voice of Roger. These initial efforts, though, would end up getting delayed as the project entered a period of early development hell, with not much progress being made until finally, in 1985, the project would be rebooted with engagement from Amblin Entertainment, which was Steven Spielberg's production company. After Spielberg got involved, the entire Roger Rabbit adaptation gained significantly more traction, with Spielberg himself spearheading agreements between a number of different animation studios to use their characters in the eventual crossover film, Disney investing $30 million in the project's creation, making it the most expensive animated film ever made, and the story being rewritten to focus on the 1940s golden age of animation, as opposed to the 1980s comic strip focus of the original novel. Along the way, the overall narrative would become a bit more comedic and decidedly less dark, until finally, the film moviegoers would know as Who Framed Roger Rabbit released to theaters in the summer of 1988. Upon its release, Who Framed Roger Rabbit would be met with universal critical acclaim, with some publications declaring it one of the best comedies of all time, while moviegoers flocked to the theaters to see the unique blend of live action and cartoon animation play out on the big screen. Who Framed Roger Rabbit would accumulate over $350 million in ticket sales around the world, making it the second highest grossing film of the year, while also being recognized with 7 Academy Award nominations, winning 4 in the process. In later years, the film would be noted as one of the saviors of Walt Disney Animation, and a key factor in Disney's resurgence in the 1990s as one of the best animation studios in the world, while also influencing other studios to develop their own live-action cartoon hybrid films in the years to come. In short, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a big deal. And, as with many big deal movie properties, it didn't take long before serial licensee LJN would acquire the rights to make a video game based on the film, which they promptly presented to game developer Rare to bring to life. Rare, seeing an opportunity to work on a game with a big-ticket movie license and significant potential sales, leapt at the opportunity to create the title. And with that, work on Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the Nintendo Entertainment System officially got underway. As with many licensed titles around this time, the overall goal was to release the game as close as possible to the release date of the film. And with the movie already releasing in theaters before work on the game even began, the team at Rare was behind the 8 ball to deliver something as quickly as possible. The small team at Rare got together to create the game, settling on a story that mostly followed the major plot points of the film, a framework that involved multiple gameplay styles and perspectives, 8-bit cartoon-styled visuals to depict various toon characters in the game, and a soundtrack that attempted to adapt the jazzy tunes from the film into a chiptune rendition playable on NES sound hardware. And, in an effort to reward investigative players, Rare would even imbue the game with some secrets to discover, with the most notable being Jessica Rabbit's phone number, an actual live phone number that connected directly to the Rare tips and hints line for the game. As with many games from around this time that tried to do a similar real-world tie-in, that number would eventually transition to other companies that were definitely not associated with Rare or Roger Rabbit, which might cause some confusion for players who did not play the game when the title first released. Even more confusing was a period of time in the 90s when Jessica Rabbit's number would redirect to an adult chatline service, which, let me tell you, is not a number you want your younger children calling in the hopes of speaking with an animated cartoon character. Anyway, altogether, the team spent the better part of a year working on the title, until finally, right before Who Framed Roger Rabbit the movie would come out on videocassette for viewers to enjoy at home, Who Framed Roger Rabbit the video game would come out on the NES, making its way to market in September of 1989. Upon its release, the game would be met with mixed reviews, with some publications rating the game as a solid 4 out of 5 stars kind of title, while others declared it was one of the worst games they had ever played. Seriously, the gap between the best and worst reviews was pretty wide, and unfortunately for Rare and LJN, the game would never really attain any significant sales figures beyond the typical licensed NES title, which meant it sold well enough to warrant purchasing the license in the first place, but never made its way onto any sustained sales charts for any period of time. It was, by all accounts, a fairly average release. As you might expect with a title that had no commercial success to speak of, Who Framed Roger Rabbit the game wouldn't have much of a lasting legacy, and today it's very rare to hear anyone even speak about the game, outside of some internet personalities who have played it solely to roast it for being a licensed NES title, by infamous publisher LJN, in a time when, from their perspective, most licensed titles sucked. I'll let you know my own opinion in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, my general rule of thumb applies here. If you have an interest in a game, you really should try it for yourself rather than blindly listening to someone who may or may not have a specific financially driven reason for reacting to a game in a specific way. I'm not saying to discount other people's opinions entirely. I'm just saying sometimes you have to form your own opinions, especially on titles widely considered to be quote-unquote bad. While Who Framed Roger Rabbit the game might not have had much of a legacy, the studio behind the game, Rare, would undeniably go on to bigger and better things, including the creation of the Donkey Kong Country series, the release of numerous blockbuster hits for the Nintendo 64 console like GoldenEye 007, Perfect Dark, and Conker's Bad Fur Day, and eventually being purchased by Microsoft, where Rare continues to make brand new video game experiences even today. While they may not be as well regarded today as they were back in the 90s and early 2000s, innovation and excellence still pervade Rare's DNA, and I personally continue to look forward to their future work. At first glance, Who Framed Roger Rabbit might appear to be a typical licensed NES title, but thinking of it solely from that perspective would be a bit too reductive. While yes, it was a licensed NES title, it still warrants consideration as one of the earlier efforts from Rare, a company that would come to be known for its immensely talented staff, as well as being the interactive version of a film that would be incredibly popular and influential across the entire world. While Roger Rabbit's game-based antics might not be remembered all that fondly today, that in no way means the game should be allowed to wallow in obscurity, and in fact, I do believe it's a good time to shine a bit of a spotlight on the title. It might not be the first game most people think of when they hear the company name Rare, but for fans of the game and the movie, there's definitely something more to appreciate here. For those individuals, Who Framed Roger Rabbit will likely remain an interesting, if not somewhat obscure, nostalgia trip to simpler times, and as such is certainly a title that deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Who Framed Roger Rabbit today versus when it was released over 35 years ago. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is one of the more eclectic mixes of gameplay styles that I've come across in a game, and I will admit being surprised at just how much variety Rare was able to shoehorn into the title. Just at a glance, you have elements of point-and-click adventure games, side-scrolling action titles, overhead racing titles, and humor-driven trivia games, and each of these elements combine together to form a unique experience that is unlike most other games released in the 80s, and quite frankly, more diverse than a number of titles released in later years as well. So, let's talk about Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The main premise behind the game follows the general storyline of the movie on which the game is based, which is that Marvin Acme, the current seemingly benevolent owner of Toontown, is found murdered, and his will is nowhere to be found. This leaves all of the cartoon residents of Toontown in a state of limbo, whereby they don't know what's going to happen to their beloved world, as without a will, it's unclear what's going to happen to Acme's ownership in Toontown. Luckily for the Toons, Private Detective Eddie Valiant was hired to solve the case, and he, alongside constant companion Roger Rabbit, take it upon themselves to find Acme's will and, hopefully, keep Toontown and its residents safe. Within the context of the game, finding Acme's will is the core quest that you have to complete in order to progress to the final encounter, and the will itself has been split into 4 different pieces and scattered across the various locations that you'll be exploring as you play the game, which includes 2 different areas in Toontown, downtown Los Angeles, and the outskirts of the city. In my playthrough, 1 piece of Acme's will was found in each of those 4 locations, which makes perfect sense as a way of encouraging players to explore the entire game world, but I'm honestly not sure if that was pure luck, or if the placement of each piece of the will is randomly assigned. Because Roger Rabbit is designed to provide a brand new experience every time you play the game, with every single item randomly placed across the game's world, making it so that every time you play the game, you're effectively starting from scratch. The good news is that the base maps and locations you'll be able to navigate to don't change from one playthrough to the next, and there are a ton of different spots you'll be able to explore. The majority of these locations are found on the downtown LA and Toontown maps, both of which are dotted with a bunch of different buildings with interior rooms that you can investigate, while the outskirts of the city is primarily an overland kind of area with several caves that may, or may not, be hiding necessary items. The game is structured around several different gameplay styles, all of which you'll need to experience in order to navigate around the game's world and search for clues and items to help you progress your quest. When you first start playing the game, you'll begin in Eddie Valiant's office, and here's where you'll be exposed to the first gameplay style that the game utilizes, that being a pseudo point-and-click adventure interface. You control Eddie, and by default, you'll see a side-scrolling-like perspective of your environment, with Roger Rabbit wandering around as well, though he's effectively just window dressing and doesn't really participate in your investigation, other than being a hindrance in certain situations, which we'll eventually talk about. In this side-scrolling view, your main objective is to explore the environment, picking up items that might either be visible on the ground, or potentially hidden in various environmental features like desk drawers, trash cans, mouse holes, and closed dressers. Navigating these environments is pretty simple. You use your directional pad to move Eddie around the environment, and if there's anything you want to search, you simply walk up to it and press the A button, which starts a several second period of time where you're stuck searching whatever object you clicked on, so to speak. If there's an item to be found, it'll fly out from the object you were searching, and you'll automatically pick it up and add it to your inventory. If there isn't an item to be found, the game will simply tell you that nothing was found, and you can proceed on with your adventure. Now, something that warrants mentioning is the fact that the game world in Roger Rabbit is huge, with each location, building, or room having a ton of spots that could potentially hide useful items. If you were forced to search every nook and cranny for these hidden objects, gameplay would quickly become tedious, as the majority of items you search don't really contain anything of value, and searching an entire building can take a couple minutes of your time, most of which is spent not finding anything useful. Luckily, the game also includes a number of random non-player characters in each scene, and in the majority of cases, these characters exist solely to give you a clue as to whether a given location is worth searching or not. If your current location might have something useful to discover, one of those random characters might say something like, "You should try searching this building." If not, then they'll say something like, "This building is empty," which means no need to spend any time at that specific location. Feel free to move on. This was a feature I appreciated, as it helped to hone my search and keep gameplay a bit less tedious than what it otherwise could have become. And you better believe every time I entered a new location, I quickly sought out one of the computer-controlled characters to see if there was anything useful to find. Interestingly, while the game starts out with random item placements, the repopulation of items in the world also appears to be random, in that you might explore a building only to be told it's empty, and then return to that building 10 minutes later to discover a new item had spawned in that location, which admittedly would be a really poor design for a quote-unquote real point-and-click adventure title, where there are certain critical path items that you have to acquire in order to progress your story. In Roger Rabbit, though, the majority of items in the game are simply enhancers, or enable certain features, and are therefore not 100% required to complete the game. There are a handful of items that you will need to progress throughout your journey, like the 4 pieces of Acme's Will, which is the main quest you need to complete, several sticks of dynamite and a detonator, which is the way you open up access to Toontown, a flashlight and pogo shoes, which are needed to illuminate and explore the game's various caves, and several animal-centric distraction items, like meat for dogs or rattles for snakes, which allow you to pacify certain creatures and grab any items that might otherwise be guarded by them. Otherwise, most of the items in the game, and there are truly a ridiculous number, are simple weapons that may or may not have specific situational use, or utility items for exploring certain areas of the game world, like crowbars which can unlock padlocked doors, or a whistle which can call Benny the Cab to assist with traveling on the overworld map's various roadways. Finding the various items in the game can add a bit of a grind, as like I said, there are certain items that are required to progress throughout the game, and there is no guarantee that you'll find the items you need in any given location. Most items are consumable as well, meaning that once you use them up, you'll have to find them again, which can similarly add additional non-value-added time to your overall playthrough. There is a store where you can buy certain items, but that store's inventory is also driven by random chance. Or at least it feels random. I will admit that the store oftentimes had the exact item I needed at various points in my playthrough, which was either ridiculous luck, or the game's way of giving a little bit of an assist for players who'd rather spend their in-game money as opposed to exploring the world in the hopes of finding the items you need. The majority of the game is spent exploring locations and finding items to build up your inventory, which is where the point-and-click styled gameplay comes into play. The side-scrolling sections of the game are also where you'll experience Roger Rabbit's version of combat, which is super simple in comparison to even the most simple combat-oriented titles. As Eddie Valiant, you have access to your inventory of items, a number of which are weapon-like objects, as well as a default punch, which you can power up by continuously tapping the B button on your controller before stopping and, hopefully, unleashing a powerful attack that hits your opponent. The only real combat to speak of occurs randomly on various screens, where one of the weasels, the cartoon band of villains, will appear on the screen and force you into a battle. Whenever that happens, Roger Rabbit jumps to the top of the screen, keeping himself hidden from the battle, as you're forced to deal with the weasel in question before you're allowed to leave the screen. This requires you to power up your punches, which when combined with pressing a direction on your control pad, can start what appears to be a hop-on-one-foot power-up move that allows you to both traverse the screen and redirect power to your punch, and combat is effectively doing a bunch of these punch-hop moves and hitting your opponents more than they hit you. Actually executing that move and hitting your opponent can be a bit tricky, and there's definitely a need to get used to this unique approach to combat before you'll be effective. Like I mentioned before, there are also a number of weapons available that you might find as you explore the game world, but from my perspective, using weapons in battle is an entirely hit-or-miss experience. There were several times I attempted to use weapons to make a battle easier or shorter, only to realize that the weapons didn't really seem to make my battle easier or shorter. The only way I ended up doing any appreciable damage was by using my punches, which was really weird to me, especially when you have access to a gun, brick, and various other damaging weaponry. It's entirely possible the weapons were doing something, but I honestly couldn't tell during my playthrough, so most of the time, the weapons took a back seat to good old-fashioned fisticuffs, which seemed to work much better, at least for me. Anyway, after you explore a given location, or deal with whatever weasel has decided to attack you, you'll have to figure out how to get to other locations to continue your quest. And here's where another gameplay style comes into play, that of the overhead, slightly angled driving kind of title. By default, when you leave any given location, you'll appear on the overworld map, on foot, and will be allowed to walk to any other location within the current geographic area you're in, either downtown LA, the city's outskirts, or Toontown. Actually transitioning between each geographic area requires using Benny the Cab, which we'll talk about in a second, but within a certain area, you can get pretty much everywhere by simply walking. The thing is though, walking is really not the best way to get around in Roger Rabbit, as it opens you up to a number of deadly situations that, should they occur, will really ruin your day. First off, the roads all have computer-controlled cars which constantly drive around the game world, and they can come into contact with both you and Roger. If a car runs over Roger, no big deal, since he's attuned to begin with, so he simply pops back up after a few seconds completely unscathed. If a car hits Eddie though, that's an instant death, and you'll lose a life unceremoniously before being dropped back into the game. Assuming you can avoid getting run over by a car, you also have to contend with various other enemies that dot the landscape, including a snake who will chase you across the world in the hopes of killing you, a bird that if he swoops down and carries Roger away will cost you a life, and a roving weasels gang who, if they catch you, will introduce you to yet another gameplay style, that being an insult sword fighting-esque mode where you have to figure out the punchline to any number of jokes that they tell you. More on that mode in just a little bit. First though, let's go back to the overland map. If you don't want to walk around everywhere, and honestly with the size of the world, you really don't want to do that, you also have the option of hailing Benny the Cab by using one of the items you can acquire during your playthrough, that being a whistle. Using that whistle will summon Benny, and you can get in him, so to speak, to drive around the various geographic regions in the game, much faster and safer than simply walking from place to place. The nice thing when using Benny is that you can collide with other cars without taking any sort of damage, and you can run over other cartoon characters like the aforementioned Snake and Weasel Gang without facing any danger. Even the Roger snatching bird can't do anything as long as you're in Benny, which means that for the most part, you're safe from the dangers of the world as long as you're with Benny. You're not entirely safe though, as the weasels can occasionally chase after you in their paddy wagon, and if they catch you, they'll start the joke punchline minigame just the same as if they had captured Roger while you were walking around the world. So let's talk about that minigame a bit, just to give you all a flavor of what that's all about. If Roger gets captured by the weasels, you'll transition to a screen that shows the weasels holding Roger hostage before they tell you one of several different jokes, and the game then requires you to respond to that joke with the appropriate punchline. As part of the game's interface, you may notice a bar with a bunch of P's on it, which represents your total punchline bank that you've collected while playing the game. When you first start out, you only have a handful of punchlines available to you, which makes matching the right punchline with the appropriate joke pretty easy, as the game will never give you a joke that you don't currently know the punchline to. As you get captured by the weasels though, your punchline bank will increase, giving you a greater number of punchline options, and by extension, increasing the number of potential jokes the weasels may present you with during the joke punchline minigame, which does increase the overall difficulty of the encounter. Note though that difficulty in this context isn't associated with matching the right punchlines and jokes, because those are super easy to figure out and they all make logical sense. As an example, you might get a joke that goes something like, what kind of insect makes a noise that sounds like zub 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 zub? The answer, of course, is a bee flying backwards. Get it? Because zub is buzz in reverse, like the word itself, it's in reverse. Anyway. All of the jokes in the game are similarly styled, and I'd venture a guess that anyone older than 10 years old should be able to figure out the joke punchline pairs without much issue. The more challenging part is cycling through all of the punchlines you have at your disposal in the 10 seconds that the game gives you to answer the weasel's prompt. If you're able to cycle through to the right punchline before the time runs out, then you save Roger, and you both go off to fight another day, albeit with an extra punchline added to your list to cycle through in the future. If you don't find the right punchline in time though, you'll lose a life and be dropped back into the game world wherever you were originally captured. And actually, it might make sense to talk about how the game handles lives and continues, because it is actually one of the more player-friendly mechanics that Rare implemented in a game from around this time frame. The way it works is, you begin the game with 3 lives and 2 continues, and your goal is to complete the entire game using that allotment of lives and continues. Like we talked about, you can lose a life through any number of ways, whether on the overland map or while in a specific building or location, where you can get attacked by any number of animals or toons to potentially make you lose a life. Assuming you lose all your lives, you'll be presented with a continue screen, as well as a 22-character password that allows you to resume the game if you need to shut your console off and go do something else. But let's say you lose your final life and your final continue. In most games from around this time, that'd be it. You'd be forced to basically replay the game from the beginning, or use the last password you had acquired to keep trying to beat the game on your last continue, which, as it often did, could have caused frustration as you kept trying and failing to beat the game. Who Framed Roger Rabbit does things a little bit differently, in that when you lose your final continue, you're still presented with a 22-character password, which you can then use to resume your adventure with a replenished bank of lives and continues, while also keeping all of your items and inventory intact, effectively making it so that you lose very little progress despite failing to beat the game. The only loss of progress that occurs is that you're forced to start back at Eddie Valiant's office, which means you'll have to travel back to wherever you previously were in order to continue your adventure. This, it turns out, is not a big deal at all, and I was pleasantly surprised that the game was as friendly to players as what it ended up being. I was fully gearing myself up to have to restart the game from the beginning, which for Roger Rabbit would have been a major issue since each playthrough is 100% randomized, so any knowledge I gained playing through it one time would not transfer to subsequent playthroughs. I'd have to explore every single location in full once again, if the game made me restart from the beginning. But I can happily say that the team at Rare designed the game to avoid that possibility, and I was certainly appreciative of that design decision. Eventually, assuming you persevere long enough to find all of the pieces of Acme's will, you'll be able to confront Judge Doom and attempt to beat the game. I have a lot to say about that fight specifically, so we're going to hold off on that discussion until a little bit later. Before we get to that, and the other more specific aspects of the game though, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have all-inclusive gameplay videos to look up and look at what a game looked like. Back when we made a buying decision, it was always based on reviews we may have read in magazines, word of mouth from family and friends, and what the box looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the NES, the back of the box says, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? You've seen the movie. You know the story. A heartbroken Hollywood toon star is accused of murdering one of the most popular men in town. The same man who was just 24 hours earlier seen playing patty cake with our star's lovely and mysterious wife. It's an open and shut case, right? Wrong. This is where your job begins. You must search high and low through downtown Los Angeles, the city park, the warehouse district, and even Toontown, looking for clues to help Eddie prove that Roger is innocent. You have to unearth all 4 pages of Marvin's missing will that will guarantee Toontown's future forever. At the same time, you must also keep the weasels from getting Roger, protect Jessica from the dreaded Dipmobile, and help Eddie stay out of jail. As if that's not enough, you must collect the right weapons, accessories, and facts that will enable you to defeat Judge Doom in the final confrontation. You'll have to call up all of your game playing and Super Sleuth detective abilities to get through this one. And there's still no guarantee. In the end, the joke could be on you. And then there are several screenshots on the back of the box showing several of the different interfaces that you have, the driving and overworld map, the side-scrolling map, the kind of point-and-click interface. And I've got to say, this box sells me on the game. Even today, this is one of those games that I did pick up back when it first came out because, first of all, I really loved Who Framed Roger Rabbit the film, and I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great to play through Who Framed Roger Rabbit the game? So I did purchase this back when I was younger. Looking at the box even today, it sells me on it. I mean, it's definitely a licensed game, and it wears its inspiration literally on its sleeve because it tells you outright, this is basically the movie, the game. It says, you know the story, you know the movie, now play the game. And it's like, yeah, I know all of that because I saw the movie. So this is not trying to market itself as something that it's not. It is very direct and saying this is a licensed title. If you like the movie, hopefully you like the game. And honestly, the box I appreciate for being that straightforward. So yes, this box definitely sells me on the title. Had I seen it on the store shelves, or if I saw it on the store shelves today, I would still pick it up. Of course, I do in fact own this one. I don't own the box anymore because I was a horrible heathen back when I was younger and didn't really think much of boxes, especially when I was in the 80s when I was kind of pre-10, so to speak. Most of those boxes for all of those games, and I have a ton of games from back when I was younger, all of those boxes are mostly no more. And I cry myself to sleep on a regular basis because of that fact. But regardless, this box sold me back then. It sells me today. It definitely belongs on your shelf if you do, in fact, own the game. Anyway, with that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Who Framed Roger Rabbit all look pretty darn good for an 8-bit title, with the whole game having a pseudo-cartoon vibe that attempts to match the overall aesthetic of various scenes in the movie, and does so with about as much accuracy as an 8-bit title could have potentially mustered. Which is to say, the game looks more like a cartoon than other cartoon-inspired titles from around this time, which I appreciate. I also appreciated the way that each environment and building was, to a degree, designed to be distinct from one another, though there is a fair amount of environmental reuse and recoloring at play here, mostly when you're visiting different buildings and exploring the rooms within those buildings. There are only a handful of truly distinct rooms and buildings, assuming you discount palette swaps, and as you play the game, the environments will begin to look similar to each other, at least within a given geographic area. Meaning, if you're in a cave, pretty much every cave will look very similar, albeit potentially with a different color palette. Explore the various buildings in downtown LA that aren't modeled after a discrete location, like the Ink and Paint Club or Eddie Valiant's office, and they'll all start looking the same. Buildings in Toontown are all different than their Los Angeles-based counterparts, but the buildings within Toontown all look very similar to one another, which can make it so that exploration isn't really all that exciting, even in the more creatively designed Toontown sections of the game. Overall, the relative sameness of the various locations across the game is a bit of a miss, and I feel like the game world itself was made too large for the capabilities of the NES of the time, meaning that the only way to have a large world depicted was to swap colors in various scenes, as opposed to creating unique environments for each location. For the locations that were unique, like the aforementioned Ink and Paint Club, the graphics looked great, so much so that I wish every location in the game had the same kind of handcrafted attention to detail as the more unique locations across the game world. If that required making the world smaller, that would have been fine for me, as in any given playthrough, there are huge swaths of land that are entirely useless. I appreciated the size of the world, but in this case, I feel like this was a quantity over quality kind of thing. The animations, meanwhile, all looked perfectly fine, with the star of the show being the cartoon-inspired characters, like Roger Rabbit himself, Jessica Rabbit, and the various goons that make up the Weasel Squad. These characters were all a bit oversized and had a level of detail, both in terms of artistic and animation quality, that exceeded the rest of the characters in the game, and I appreciated the attention that was given to making these cartoon characters come to life. Overall, the game looked pretty darn good, and while the environments can sometimes feel similar to one another, it was never enough to really detract from my enjoyment of playing the game. I do wish there was more variety, and I can only imagine what a modern remake of the game would look like. But for a late 80s 8-bit title, I can't really complain. Moving on to the sound and music. The music in Who Framed Roger Rabbit was surprisingly good, with a variety of musical motifs and styles that changed depending on your geographic location within the game's world, as well as which specific spots you were exploring within that location. I really enjoyed the music here, with my favorite tracks being those associated with the Toontown section of the game. I'm not sure if this is because they were the tracks that felt newer to me, as I did play the game as a child and recall fairly well the music used in the various non-Toontown scenes, or if the music was simply better in Toontown than in other locations throughout the game. But regardless, I really did think the music was top-notch here. Considering David Wise was the composer for the title, this probably shouldn't be a huge shock, as he was the man responsible for so many of Rare's most well-known musical tracks over the years that it's not surprising his contributions to Roger Rabbit would be high quality. But regardless, the music here is great, and I enjoyed each and every track included with the game. More limited were the game's sound effects, which sounded fine within the context of the game, but were otherwise entirely forgettable without anything to really latch onto. I don't think there was anything wrong with the sound effects in the title, it's just that there's nothing I'd personally call attention to. Bottom line, the sound and music in Roger Rabbit all sound good, and the music in particular was a personal favorite. No real complaints here, I simply enjoyed the auditory environment for the game. Moving on to the narrative and story, we've touched upon this briefly, but just for completeness sake, in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you play as Eddie Valiant, a private investigator who's been hired to solve the murder of Marvin Acme, the current owner of Toontown and presumably a friend to the Toons who live in that town. With Acme murdered, his will goes missing, and it is up to you to find the various pieces of that will to hopefully determine Toontown's fate. Along the way, you'll face a number of different enemies and obstacles, attempt to outlive and outwit the Weasel Gang, and even potentially come face to face with Judge Doom himself in a final confrontation that will determine once and for all the fate of Toontown and all of its inhabitants. The story here follows the same narrative structure as Who Framed Roger Rabbit the film, which is not particularly surprising given this was a licensed title. And honestly, the story here is perfectly fine, as there's just enough structure to give you a reason for everything you'll do in the game, while also providing motivation to continue to explore more and more of the surrounding environment, despite not really getting anything from that exploration other than some useful and potentially less useful items. There is a bit of a narrative included in the game itself, though the majority of the game's plot is relayed via the instruction manual and the player's pre-existing knowledge of the film the game was based on, which is pretty much par for the course with movie-licensed games from around this time. Overall, I think the story here worked well, though I do wish that some of the dialogues with various characters were a bit more story-oriented than simply telling you which buildings you should or shouldn't take the time to explore. I appreciated these hints, but I would have appreciated a more fleshed out dialogue system and narrative even more. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've already talked a fair amount about the game's overall structure and controls, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to mention though is that the controls all feel good, and interacting with the game world, regardless of what type of gameplay you're experiencing, whether driving, on foot, or attempting to match a punchline with a joke, all controls well. My favorite parts of the game were when it used those controls to create an experience more akin to a point-and-click adventure title, whether that meant environmental exploration or inventory-based puzzles, and I feel like the game's story could have been made considerably more deep if the design team spent some extra time working on that aspect of the title. I also appreciated the general mechanics for navigation and exploration, both of which felt engaging after getting used to the overall framework of the game. I will admit that the number of locations to potentially explore, coupled with the fact that most of those locations contained nothing of value, was a bit of a miss from my standpoint, and I felt like the extra buildings were included simply to pad out the length of the game. I have no proof for that assertion, it's just something I felt as I was playing through the entirety of the experience. Actually moving around various locations felt fine, though I did notice that the controls could get a bit slippery in certain situations, with momentum that felt more like your character was sliding on ice as opposed to walking around on solid ground. This was really only noticeable when attempting to pick up an item from the floor, where if you're pressing down on your control pad, you could potentially leave the area unintentionally as your inertia carried you past the item and onto an adjoining screen. This didn't happen a ton, but when it did happen, it was a bit frustrating. That being said, I do have some additional critiques, some of which did serve to detract from my overall enjoyment of the game. The first, though not a major issue, was the fact that while the number of items in the game was vast, the total number of meaningful items was pretty darn small. I picked up a ridiculous number of items throughout the game, and there was a good chunk of them that I legitimately never used or even felt a need to use. It's entirely possible that I made things harder on myself by not using these items, but I legitimately didn't find a need to use a good portion of my inventory. Things like the 6-shooter, whipped cream pie, and portable hole, all of those items ostensibly served a purpose, and taken at face value, they seemed like they'd be useful. But I ended up not needing to use them at all, primarily because they didn't serve a needed purpose in the game. Does that mean they should have been dropped from the game's design? I'm not sure, because I do appreciate the variety of the items on display here. But once again, this feels like a quantity over quality kind of situation. And for me, I'd rather have had a more discrete focused list of items that truly served a purpose, like what you'd see in a traditional adventure title, rather than having access to everything and the kitchen sink, and then not using the majority of them. And speaking of items, the fact that each item in the game was randomly placed throughout the game world, and could potentially shift positions at whim, made the overall gameplay experience a bit more cumbersome than I would have preferred. I hit a couple situations where I needed a specific item to proceed, like a flashlight, only to discover that I didn't have any flashlights left in my inventory, which then required me to search numerous locations in the hopes of finding that random item. Overall, I didn't end up wasting too much time looking for specific items, but it is something that could occasionally slow down forward momentum, if only for a little bit. Also slowing down momentum were the various situations that could cause an untimely death, which for the most part were entirely avoidable for observant players. There were a couple situations though where death became almost unavoidable, which was a bit of a frustration. The most prominent of these, at least with my playthrough, was getting attacked while I was in the middle of a conversation with a computer-controlled character, which effectively locked me in place while I was getting pummeled by an attacking creature or character. There were also a couple locations where one-hit kill creatures could be prowling the sidewalks, and if you dared to show up on the screen, they'd make a beeline for you, killing you nearly instantaneously unless you moved preemptively. I'm not the biggest fan of situations where you can only avoid death through trial and error, so these situations left a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth. The biggest issue with the game though, by far, has to be the very final fight in the game. Everything else we've talked about so far has represented minor annoyances, or things that I wish were refined or streamlined a bit more, but weren't significant enough to dramatically impact my overall enjoyment. The final fight with Judge Doom though, that made me question my sanity. I'm going to paint you a picture. You've just collected the final piece of Marvin Acme's will, and now with all 4 pieces in hand, you ready yourself for your final confrontation with Judge Doom. You make your way to his factory, distract the guard at the front door, and enter the final arena. Upon entering the factory, you survey the scene and discover that Roger and Jessica Rabbit are both suspended from the ceiling in front of a dip dispensing machine, a scene that is likely recognizable for anyone who's seen the movie, but for the uninitiated, represents a surefire death for our 2 protagonists. Dip is like ultra-powerful acid to tunes, and if Roger and Jessica are doused with the dip, they will certainly die. Judge Doom is standing on a catwalk above the dip machine, and you know that the only way to save Roger and Jessica is to defeat Judge Doom and disable the dip machine. So you walk to a nearby ladder, climb up to the catwalk, and get ready to battle Judge Doom once and for all. At this point in the game, you've probably gathered a ton of different items and weapons, and you might be thinking to yourself that some of those weapons, like a revolver, would make short work of Judge Doom. So you pull out your gun and fire at the evil judge, only, no damage done. That's weird. Okay, maybe he's wearing a bulletproof vest. No problem. You grab one of your bricks and, winding up, toss a literal cement block at the judge's head. You get some points for a successful hit, only, his hit points, they didn't deplete at all. That's really strange. Okay, maybe you need to use a more cartoon-like approach, so you grab a cream pie and toss it at Judge Doom's unprotected cranium. Only, nope, still no damage. At this point, you might be wondering, what the heck is going on? Well, it turns out that only bombs and exploding cigars can damage Judge Doom, and considering you can only hold 9 of each item in your inventory, that means you have a max of 18 total items that can potentially damage Judge Doom. That's cool. I'm sure explosives will make short work of the judge. So you go up to the judge and drop all of your explosives one after another. And discover that you've only done around 20% total damage to Judge Doom. That leaves 80% damage left to deal, and only your default punch able to do any damage. Okay, maybe your punches are super powerful versus Judge Doom. So you ball up your fist and swing at the judge, only to do a literal sliver of damage to his life bar. At this point, you're probably thinking, There's no way Rare designed a boss that would take such little damage, because a successful fight would likely take at least 5 to 10 minutes to pull off. Only here, you would be wrong, because that's exactly what Rare did. And further, they designed the encounter such that whenever the judge was executing his own attack, he would take no damage at all, despite you scoring a successful hit. And every single one of the judge's attacks does significantly more damage to your own hit points than what your attacks do to the judge. The end result of all of that is a fight that is ridiculously cheap, where several mistakes can completely derail an otherwise perfect run, and actually defeating the judge requires the patience of a saint, because you have to wait for the precise right moments to strike, and even then, the judge might do an instantaneous punch move and both damage you and knock you back across the catwalk. So incredibly frustrating. So, let's say you manage to deplete the judge's hit points enough to defeat him. Well, you haven't really defeated him yet, because all that happens is he falls down to the ground and the dip machine starts up and begins to aim towards Roger and Jessica. Obviously, you can't let the dip hit them, so you descend the ladder, climb the dip machine, and attempt to navigate to the dip hose, only to discover that actually moving off of the ladder and towards the hose requires a specific pixel to be stood upon before you can walk toward the hose. Okay, fine, you figure that part out and pick up the dip hose. You descend the machine's ladder, after which Judge Doom rises to his feet and charges at you immediately, with one hit causing an instant death if he comes into contact with you at all. Obviously, the answer is to shoot dip at him. So, next time, after taking another 5 to 10 minutes to beat him down again because the fight does reset itself, you grab the dip hose, descend the ladder, and begin wailing on your B button to fire dip at the judge. Only, there's no way you can physically press the B button fast enough to damage Judge Doom enough to prevent his one-hit kill. But still, you think maybe, just maybe, you have to press your button even faster. So you try, again and again, only to be thwarted by the judge each and every time. Then, after all of that, and several hours trying to beat the judge, you find out that for the first time in the entire game, the solution is that you have to hold the B button down as opposed to press it rapidly. Doing that, you finally defeat the judge and beat the game, after which you're treated to a 5-second cutscene before the game unceremoniously restarts itself. Let me tell you, that fight, seriously, is one of the worst fights I've played in recent years. That singular, boring, tedious, obnoxiously designed fight was almost enough to make me want to punch Christopher Lloyd in the face, and he wasn't even in the game. The digital Judge Doom was so irritating that it made me dislike the film version of Doom even more. That's how bad it was. Everything else in the game, entirely forgivable, and ultimately not a huge deal. The Judge Doom fight though? What the heck was Rare thinking? There is no reason why it had to be designed so poorly. From my perspective, a serious miss, and something that frustrated me immensely. For the most part though, other than that final fight, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a fun, albeit somewhat flawed experience, where the good mostly outweighed the bad. The Judge Doom fight though, that was a whole new layer of awful, and I still can't believe the company that would give us Donkey Kong Country, GoldenEye 007, Killer Instinct, Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Kazooie, and countless other mega hits would design a boss encounter as infuriatingly irritating as the Judge Doom fight. I suppose Rare still had something to learn back in 1989, but even so, I cannot forgive them for that particular mess of a fight. So, what is our verdict on Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Well, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a mostly interesting, engaging, and fun experience, hampered by some design decisions that made the game feel a bit less streamlined than it likely should have, and one major design decision that will cause immense pain to anyone trying to beat the game. Even with the Judge Doom fight, I still believe the good outweighs the bad, and generally speaking, I did enjoy my time playing the game. Do you have to play this one? No, I don't think you do. But I still think there's some good stuff here, especially if you have an interest in the unique combination of different gameplay styles that Rare included with the game, which from my perspective was pretty innovative for the time. Because there's more good than bad here, and because of the innovation on display, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a worthy addition to our list of golden oldies. It's not without its frustrations, and it's not without some questionable design decisions. But overall, there's still a lot to like here, even with the frustrations we've talked about. It's never going to be mentioned in the same breath as Rare's other, more well-designed titles, but that doesn't mean it deserves to be forgotten, which is why Who Framed Roger Rabbit has just become the newest member on our list of Golden Oldies. That was our episode on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on the Atari classic Pitfall, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Pitfall. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.